Let's bring you this now. The middle class in South Africa is currently struggling. A third of households earning 10,000 rand or more per month has lost income due to blackouts. Two-thirds indicate power cuts have increased their household costs. Another financial burden is the so-called double tax. So as basic service delivery crumbles, people are forced to fund their own healthcare, education, security, and even more recently, electricity generation. So let's discuss this now with Chris Hattingh, Head of Policy Analysis at the Centre for Risk Analysis. Thank you so much, Chris. A very warm good afternoon to you. And thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Listen, when I read that link alone, it reminds me of a tweet I just actually read just post this earthquake that we all experienced this morning in Gauteng. Someone saying, Chris, we need a holiday come Monday because we're just so traumatized as a country. If it's not an earthquake, it's load shedding. If it's not load shedding, it's our finances. But speaking about this middle class, right, what are they currently going through? How dire are their finances right now? Also bearing in mind double tax.
Good afternoon to Melo and to the viewers. Thank you for the opportunity. I think the biggest burden at the moment is inflation. So with inflation remaining somewhat sticky, it did ease a bit at the last iteration at 6.8%, so down from 7.1%. But when you've got relatively high inflation, that effectively eats away at people's disposable income. And then when you have the other burden of continually higher food and fuel prices, that eats away at your disposable income. So if you're in a higher income bracket, for example, you can spend money, you can still continue to save, you can spend on your children's education, quality education, you can pay off your car repayments, your bonds, all that sort of thing. If you're in a lower income bracket, that means more of your disposable income has to go towards those very important essential goods that people need on a day-to-day basis. According to Stats SA, for example, if you are in the poorest households, according to Stats SA, you spend about half of your annual budget on food and non-alcoholic beverages. For people in higher income brackets, they only spend about 11%. So when you've got high inflation, higher food, fuel prices, that effectively means that poorer to middle income citizens aren't as economically mobile, economically active as they would be. And in turn, it will impact them later in life as well as their children.
Chris, oftentimes we hear that the reason why there's increased crime in this country, besides the fact that obviously criminality is because of the high stats of unemployment and poverty in this country. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is just way too wide. What are the consequences should this inflation continue to affect most of those low income and middle class households? I mean, what are the consequences of, where potentially this country could go?
Right. This is not to justify, sort of criminality or those sorts of acts that would go part and parcel with that. But when one has years and years of people being told that, economic growth will happen, things will be provided for them, that sense of frustration builds. And that energy has to be vented out or let out in different ways. It might manifest in quite destructive ways. Unfortunately, now I'm not going to try and tell you we'll see a repeat of the July 2021 riots on a specific date. But if you've got this underlying frustration, the sense that things aren't improving, that over time people are becoming materially poorer, and we've seen that since about 2008 up until now in terms of GDP per capita, so GDP per head for South Africans, they've become on average poorer by an average of 1,620 rand. So their money doesn't go as far as it used to. They can't provide for themselves and their families like they did. They've got many fewer job opportunities. The education system doesn't necessarily equip younger South Africans to enter a job market that is increasingly globally interconnected. So you've got all those factors feeding into this sort of malaise and this frustration on the ground. With that said, there are many opportunities for creating more inclusive economic growth, upskilling people, giving them those opportunities, not just relying maybe on public sector employment, for example, waiting for things to be solved in a top-down manner. But for now, we've created that condition where we shouldn't be surprised or caught off guard if maybe there is more sort of social unrest, protest action in the future.
Also, I mean, just speaking about the fact that employers as well, need to bear in mind about this. We have the stripe right now on our screens talking about those with secured lending obviously being also affected. Does this also run the risk for employers finding themselves in a situation whereby employees now have, to find other alternative sources of income? This could be distracting. If you have a permanent employment or a job and now you're trying to scramble to find other ways to source an income or earn an income, just so you can make up, for the debts that you are incurring, obviously due to this inflation?
No, absolutely. I think it presents that risk for the employer side, but also then for the employee side, where maybe you're never mind working 2 or 3 jobs if you have a 2-person headed household, but you have to work even more jobs. I mean, who has that sort of time, that ability to work 4 or 5 jobs, even if they get those sorts of opportunities? So the obligation here then on the employer to realize where they need to deal with their expenses and not, where they can also help their employees, and not in a sustainable long-term manner. Don't just do things sort of overnight, but then also the responsibility on the employee side, where we've all got aspirations, we've all got certain ways that we want to live up to, certain standards, but maybe realizing for the next 3 to 5 years, I would say, maybe we can't have those, flashy things, quote unquote, that we would have before. Maybe we should do better to save longer term instead of spending on expenditure in the short term. Maybe let's invest a bit longer and see how things play out in terms of inflation. The Reserve Bank sees it reaching the target of its inflation band, that would be 4.5% by the second half of 2025. So let's say we get there, let's assume that best case scenario, then play it out a bit through the next year and a half, and make sure you don't spend too much on things that are going to put you in an even worse debt situation. Absolutely.
Couldn't agree more with you there. Reminds me of the saying that downgrading is almost the new luxury, right? Chris, we have to find ways in which we just downscale for now and find, our feet, even though we do have those aspirations, like you mentioned. But for now, it would make better, wiser financial sense, of course, to try and live within your means, or even below your means, for that matter. But I appreciate you speaking to me, Chris. Always a pleasure having you on right here on eNCA. Chris Hattingh, Head of Policy Analysis at the Centre for Risk Analysis.